Welcome to our podcast, Was Justice Delivered? Your go-to source for interesting, provocative, and in-depth legal analysis. I'm your host, Dror Bikel. We are honored to have on our podcast today Dr. Dan O'Leary, a leading national expert on the issue of domestic violence. Dr. O'Leary is a distinguished professor at Stony Brook University in New York. He is also the director of the Relationship and Forensic Assessment Center at Stony Brook. He is the past president of the Association of Family and Conciliation Courts. For over 25 years, he has conducted forensic custody evaluations for various courts. He is the author of 13 books and over 300 publications. Dr. O'Leary is the recipient of numerous awards and has served on several scientific boards, including the Center for Disease Control and the National Institute of Mental Health. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. O'Leary.
Thank you for having me.
It's quite a background you have. How did you come to specialize in the area of domestic violence?
One of my graduate students actually was on an internship at a county mental health clinic, and he was trying to help a wife extricate herself from a difficult abusive situation. And the husband came to the clinic with a knife and a desire to end his life.
My goodness.
Fortunately, Rosenthal was not there at that point, and they took this man off to a mental hospital. But that prompted Rosenthal to say, can you help me learn more about partner violent men and how they are different from men that are in difficult relationships but are not physically aggressive to their partner.
That's quite an entry getting into this field. What's the difference between domestic violence and partner violence? I know domestic violence is a broad term. So How would you distinguish the two?
Domestic violence is the broader term, basically referring both to child abuse and partner abuse. And partner abuse, the more narrow term, refers to physical aggression, psychological aggression, sexual aggression, and more recently, stalking, particularly through electronic devices.
Dr. O'Leary, let's break this down. So when you talk about emotional abuse, now we're talking about between partners, what does that look like?
Probably the most important thing about emotional abuse is critical comments of almost any kind, but the most salient kind of abuse really is where, let's say, a man focuses on the things that he knows are important to a woman. Let's say she has always felt she looked good, and this guy calls her fat, ugly, whatever. For somebody else whose thing is really doing well academically, calling them dumb, stupid, whatever. Essentially, comments that go directly to one's self-esteem.
Okay. I mean, we know the extreme acts of violence, but what are, like murder, for example, but what are some of the less extreme acts of violence that you would classify as partner violence?
Well, the most common acts of aggression, pushing, slapping, shoving, sometimes hitting with a fist, but the vast majority of aggression in the United States in young couples is what I just said, basically pushing, slapping, and shoving. It's the extreme that's unusual that we hear about in the papers, but it's a small percentage of the physical aggression that exists in couples.
What about financial abuse? Is that a form of partner violence?
It is, and that generally occurs in the more extreme cases, often referred to as batterers, where these men do engage in pretty serious physical aggression, sometimes causing injury. In addition, they'll pull the spark plugs on a car. If you have a car with spark plugs, they'll take the keys, they'll take the checkbook, basically try to prevent the woman from having any sense of agency.
And what about coercive control? That's a form of abuse that has kind of gotten traction more recently, I believe. And I think even in Europe, in some countries, some of the Nordic countries especially, it's actually a crime. Not in the United States, but what is coercive control?
Coercive control refers basically to almost any acts of one person against the other where you're trying to limit what they can do, whether they can spend time with friends, whether they can have free access to the phone, free access to the checking account, and so forth. That coercive control has sometimes been seen under the rubric power and control, and the power and control conceptualization was frankly the most important conceptualization for decades in this country. It's now been seen as basically one of many things, but power and control have long been seen, particularly in the more severe cases, as crucial.
So it's one person removing the partner from emotional supports like families and friends.
Yes.
From access to financial resources, such as putting all the assets in the perpetrator's name and not giving the, let's call it victim for the purpose of this conversation.
Exactly, yes.
Not giving the victim access, limiting movement. Is that
all
part
of
it?
that?
Say
yes.
You have to stay at home. Threats of physical intimidation. Yeah.
Basically, do whatever you can to minimize the extent to which this person can reach out, have the ability to act on their own.
How common is partner violence in the United States?
Well, if one is referring to how common is it in the general population, we now know that it occurs in about 15% of the population. Again, that's in any randomly selected population. When we think about groups of people that are discordant that come to clinics like the one that I have, or marital clinics across the country, about 50 to 60% of those individuals have some form of physical partner aggression. And thinking about the kinds of cases that we see in the courts, going through the divorce process or fighting about parenting, certainly I would estimate that you're going to have at least the number that we have in marital clinics and probably more. So I would estimate, though I don't know of a study, I would estimate that probably 60 to 70% of the cases going through the court have some form of partner aggression.
How does it break down socioeconomically? Is it more prevalent among those in a higher socioeconomic class or a lower socioeconomic class? Can you break it down that way?
What we now know is that there's a small association with socioeconomic class, but fortunately a man named Murray Strauss at the University of New Hampshire showed with large national samples that there's frankly only a small association with socioeconomic class. It exists in people from the high socioeconomic classes as well as the lower socioeconomic classes. But to put this in perspective in terms of the more severe kinds of aggression, the more severe kinds of aggression does come from lower socioeconomic classes, as do the cases of murder of partners in this country.
Why do you think that is?
I think that often men referred to batters programs don't have jobs. They may be under the eye of probation, and even with that, they'll continue to violate the protective orders. Unfortunately, the more severe cases, often in these batter programs, have pretty significant substance abuse. They don't have a good job. They're not as likely to be having contact with their kids and so on. But I would like to emphasize that there is a fairly significant group, sometimes 50 to 60% of men referred to batters programs that do have good jobs. They have good connections. And without going into detail, we have studied this in Cook County, Illinois, and found those men with good connections with society do quite well in batterers programs, and they could do well probably in fairly short programs.
So what I'm understanding is that domestic violence and partner violence occurs regardless of socioeconomic class. Perhaps some of the more extreme cases are more prevalent in the lower socioeconomic classes, but could that be because the perpetrators have less to lose at that point?
Exactly. The perpetrator has less to lose, and they don't give a damn often, even if their probation officer is on them, or if they have an ankle device where, let's say, the partner is warned if the individual gets within a mile of their house, and sometimes they'll still violate it.
Right.
In part, like you say, because they're not connected to society in the way that some of these other men are.
Right, and they have less to lose.
Yeah.
What about the LGBT community? Have you seen any studies whether it's less or more prevalent in those communities?
Yes, there are a number of recent studies, and in the main, one would say that their rates of partner aggression are really not that much different from a heterosexual population, though there are particular groups, for example, lesbian women, that may have a higher rate than heterosexual women. But in the main, the rates don't seem that different.
What about between men and women? Now, we just assume that men are more frequent perpetrators of domestic violence. Is that in fact true based upon the studies that you have seen?
No, actually, this man, Murray Strauss, the person I mentioned before, who did these sort of classic studies with large populations of randomly selected people, 6,000 individuals. And he showed that actually the rate of physical aggression in the general population by men is almost identical to the rate of physical aggression by women. We have shown the same thing with a sample of 400 young couples that we followed from engagement to 3 years into marriage, and loads of other people have found the same thing. But it's pretty important to note that while the rates may be the same in a general population, the impact is highly different. Men make women fearful, they cause more injury, and 3 times more men kill their partners than women.
So the most severe cases of partner violence and domestic violence are going to be perpetrated by men. That's what I'm getting.
Exactly.
What are the underlying causes of partner violence that you see?
Well, going back to something we talked about before, power and control has been seen as a cause for a long time. But we now know that there are loads of factors that predict partner aggression. Some of the more important ones are having seen your parents hit, being hit yourself as a kid. Both have been shown to relate to partner aggression.
Because that's the model. That's you think that's normal, right? That's
you
the
think
model
it's normal.
that you grew
You've
up
seen
with.
it before.
Yeah.
It's what's called the intergenerational transmission of violence. We've known this for decades. But importantly, it's not a very strong factor. There are many other factors that are bigger. For example, having a significant anger problem, having significant hostility, misusing power and control, and having a substance abuse problem or an alcohol problem. All of those are, particularly the latter ones, substance abuse, hostility, misuse of power, and frequent arguments, the biggest predictors.
When you say frequent arguments, is one side causing the argument? Are you able to extrapolate to that detail, or are you just it being kind of a high conflict relationship?
Any high conflict relationship that's characterized by psychological aggression, particularly at the more significant level, is one of the biggest factors that's going to predict partner aggression.
How does partner violence start in a relationship? What happens in the beginning of the relationship that is kind of an indicator that this may be a problem?
I think, unfortunately, pushing and slapping and shoving has long been seen by many people as something that's no big deal. It's kind of like decades ago, you saw it on Dallas every day. And, you're drinking, you're shoving, pushing, who gives a darn? And unfortunately, we have interviewed many young couples, young married couples who have such aggression. And when you ask them about how do you feel about it, particularly if it's at the low level, they'll say, it's no big deal. He's not attempting to hurt me. I'm not attempting to hurt him. But the thing that I think it's important for people to understand is if that aggression occurs a couple times in an early marriage, like first year and the second year, we've shown there's about a 65 to 70% likelihood that it's going to occur the third year.
Well, to that point, Dr. O'Leary, how does partner violence progress during a relationship? Does it get worse? Does it get better? Have there been studies that show the progression?
Yeah, we have studied kind of like the development of aggression in couples where we looked at them from their engagement period to third year out. And what we found was about a third of the couples on Long Island engage in physical aggression against one another, and it's engaged in both by men and women. Fortunately, by the end of the third year, you see the rates of physical aggression declining. And I can also say that those who have the more severe aggression are more likely to separate. So,
okay, they're more likely to separate early on.
Yes. And one thing we know is that in both, we've done research both in the military and in the civilian sector, physical aggression from the age of 20 to the age of 60 goes down in a straight linear fashion. And I should say physical aggression against a partner.
You said something interesting, Dr. O'Leary. You said that the aggression can go back and forth. So we've always thought domestic violence and partnership violence or partner violence is a one-way kind of thing. You said something different. What did you mean by that?
Well, we know very clearly now that particularly early development of partner aggression is a dyadic process. Like I was saying before, young couples get angry, they may push each other a little bit, they shove each other a little bit, and they don't think in the first year or two it's any big deal. But again, as I said, if that continues to occur, it definitely escalates.
And it can go both ways.
Meaning it can go down.
No, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. It goes both ways, meaning if the couple's married, a heterosexual couple, the husband can push and shove the wife, but what you're saying is that it's common if that happens for the wife also to push and shove the husband.
Yes.
Are there instances where this coercive control happens that is predominantly the wife being the perpetrator? Because when you think about coercive control, and there's this Dirty John case that got a lot of press where the perpetrator was so controlling and there was violence and so much control over the relationship, and he was doing it with multiple women at a time. So we have this idea that it's the man, but can the wife also engage in coercive control?
It's possible, but traditionally, if you think about the more severe kinds of coercive control, one of those is through financial means. And traditionally, women have not had that same level of ability to control the finances or the cars or access of one kind or another. And of interest, this morning on television, I saw a new book coming out about the need for women to have the ability to use power, to use it in a positive way in their jobs, and basically just characterizing that power and control has not long been the domain of women.
Right. That's so interesting. Dr. O'Leary, so what kind of personal history does a perpetrator of partnership or partner violence have? What's childhood and what kind of history does a perpetrator have?
If I may, let me talk about the perpetrator of the more severe kinds of aggression first.
Okay.
Those individuals are individuals who have often come from intergenerational cycle of violence, where they saw their parents hit, they may have been abused, they probably developed early on as a conduct problem, engaging in aggression themselves in school, probably engage in dating aggression against their teenage partner, move into more use of alcohol and substances, and they become much more likely the people that are the batterers.
What about the victims? What kind of background do they have? If there's been a study about that.
Yeah, no, there are studies. It is unfortunate for sure, but many of the women who are victimized are repeatedly victimized by different partners. Not surprisingly, going back to that intergenerational transmission of violence, they also are more likely to have come from a home of violence where it's seen as not so unusual. And so probably if their partner engages in aggression against them when they're 18 or 20, they think, it's like what my mom and dad did. How bad is it? And things just escalate from there.
How does the perpetration of partner violence affect victims? What does it do to them emotionally, physically? Are there short-term, long-term consequences?
There are, unfortunately, both short and long-term consequences to the victims. And here I'm referring first to women as the victims. At the more severe level, clearly very significantly elevated rates of depression and PTSD. Self-esteem often is tanking. But they're also much more likely to have a host of physical problems. Difficulty sleeping, eating emotionally, gaining weight, and so forth. So there are a host of physical problems as well as the psychological kinds of problems that are important to keep in mind.
How does somebody get out of an abusive relationship? What do they do? How do you get out?
Well, one of the biggest reasons that women stay, according to a number of studies, is because they're economically tied and they don't see a way out, and they're psychologically tied. So thinking about those two causes, it's women that have some connection with family, friend, relative, somebody down the block, somebody that will help them, give them a physical out is crucial. And it was the need for developing shelters across the United States that really led to a lot of work on partner violence, because these women unfortunately didn't have any place to go. So again, in answer to your question, what will help them get out? Any connection with somebody else that would give them shelter. Any connection with somebody else, or through their own means, having enough money set aside that they could go stay in a hotel if need be, or they could pay for a train trip or a bus ride to a relative.
You talked about financial dependency, which I think we understand, but you mentioned emotional dependency.
Yes.
What do you mean by that, doctor?
Well, unfortunately, many of these women believe that if this relationship dissolves, they won't have another. Often the guys will tell them, you're such an ugly whatever, you're clearly not going to ever get anybody. And unfortunately, very often, those labels stick.
They believe it.
Yep.
Let's talk about your role as a forensic psychologist. And now you're kind of venturing into we're venturing into my wheelhouse here, the courtroom. Okay. And I know you've testified dozens and dozens, if not more, over the years in various courts. You're one of the most renowned forensic psychologists in the country. When somebody comes to you, if you're appointed by the court to do this neutral evaluation, and there's an allegation of domestic violence, how do you assess the couple to determine whether, in fact, domestic violence or partner violence took place?
So going back to the point that I raised earlier about the frequency of physical aggression in discordant relationships, like the ones that come to our clinic, again, transferring that to the cases that I see in court, I'm going to assume that probably half of the cases have partner aggression. And the issue for me, and I think it of importance to the judge, is this kind of aggression, what we've heard of as common couple aggression, or is it clinically significant aggression that leads to fear and injury? So the crucial thing that I think those of us who do this kind of work need to do is separate out, is this particular case a case of common couple or situational couple aggression versus the more intimate terrorism, clinically significant aggression? And there's been a lot of work done in the military by a person named Dr. Richard Heyman, who's been able to separate these two out very neatly and show that clinicians in the military can do this reliably.
And that's what you do when you interview the parties, the husband and wife who come to you, you interview them separately. So it's through this interview process that you gather this data?
It is. And fortunately, in a forensic situation, you're not only relying on information from the two people, very often you are interviewing the kids, so you're finding out, what did they observe? Did they ever see their mom get hit? Did they see their dad get hit? What other things did they see? And often if there happened to be injury, they'll tell you. You ask for any records, any police reports. Very important, if the individuals have been seeing therapists, particularly a year or two before, often those therapy reports are crucial because they would have talked about aggression way before the separation process. So you try to triangulate by getting as many collateral sources of information as you possibly can to make this the determination, is this kind of aggression the kind that really is fear-inducing or injury-inducing, or is it the more pushing, shoving, and so forth that was done by both parties, and there really wasn't any injury that was seen or reported? There were no police reports. Maybe the kids didn't even see it.
Right. So you're looking for what they call convergent data.
Yes, exactly.
Other data points to either support or disaffirm the claims of partner violence. But what if you have a situation where there is no convergent data? In other words, no police report, nobody witnessed anything, they never went to a couples therapist, but you kind of know it in your gut that it happened. The victim has been so isolated that she didn't even think about going to a therapist. That in and of itself would be too scary. So if you have no convergent data and all you have is his story and her story, how do you determine who's telling the truth?
Actually, that is a great question. And without going into detail, it is like a case that I am on right at the very moment. The point that you make about the person possibly being so socially isolated and or feeling badly about reporting this kind of thing, not having good access environmentally to money, you are often left, as you were basically referring to a minute ago, you're often left with your ability to make your own decision about whether you think what that person did was fear-inducing or injury-producing or not, because we're often left with a he said, she said situation.
Have you ever had a situation where it was completely contrived? When you've been doing this long enough, my experience is sometimes, you can see a victim is a victim from her face. You see it on her expression. You see it the way she sits in your office, her inability to even describe what happened because she's so abused, and memory becomes so calcified in these situations, is also the humiliation factor. So you kind of see it oftentimes by the body language and the expression. And then sometimes it's the opposite and it just comes spilling out. And on those ones, at least my experience, you kind of wonder if it's true or not. I don't know. How do you distinguish between those two? And have you had a case where it was you felt it was completely contrived?
I've had many cases, and I must say I have tremendous respect for so many attorneys, but I must admit, on occasion, I'm thinking, who put you up to this?
Yeah.
You wanted him out of the house, didn't you?
Right. Strategy. It's strategy.
And an accusation of partner aggression is often a very clear road to getting one of the individuals out of the house.
Right. It can be a litigation tactic.
Yeah.
So, but what do you do in your role as a forensic custody evaluator when you're not sure, you're not sold? How do you handle that? Or do you leave it for the court as the fact finder, as the determiner?
There are situations where it is unclear to me whether there has been real partner abuse or not. And at the same time, I can pretty clearly say from information I know about how I see them interact, that they clearly would have argued like crazy, probably engaged in the lower level forms of aggression. And I simply have to sometimes say to a judge, I have no evidence that this partner engaged in fear-inducing aggression and has not, as far as I can see, engaged in clinically significant violence, but I'm pretty confident that they did engage in this other aggression, and very often they will tell you that. Yeah, we argued about this, we argued about that, and on those occasions, I have to say, I give you my honest opinion, and sometimes that opinion is I cannot make a determination of whether the accusation of clinically significant aggression rings true or not, and if it is of significance to the court, then maybe the court needs to act further to see if that's of import in cases, for example, of child custody.
When you testify, doctor, what do you try to get across when you're on the witness stand? I mean, you've testified dozens and dozens and dozens of times. Like, what are you trying to do when you're up there on the witness stand?
Well, when a forensic evaluator is asked to testify, it is usually because one of the people believes that your decision in your forensic report was the right one, meaning it was the one that is in accord with one of the attorneys. And that attorney will often be the one that asked me to testify. But it's not my job to basically simply state what I said in my report.
Right.
My job, as I see it, is to do the best I can to help the judge get a perspective on things like alcohol abuse, personality disorder, how the person interacts with the kids, and so forth, and to do the most honest job I can in providing the judge with opinions that I believe to be true, whether it happened to be exactly in accord with my recommendations or not. And on occasion, I have heard new information presented to me, and the attorney says, Dr. O'Leary, now that you know this, would your opinion change?
Right.
And in fact, on a few occasions it has.
When you talk about clinical aggression, what do you mean by that?
I meant by that clinically significant aggression, meaning the kind of aggression that either engenders fear or leads to injury.
I see. Not the kind of, and these are my words, let's call it low level.
Exactly. Lower level forms.
Lower level that maybe the parties are used to. Yep. It's not familiar to them, and they're somewhat desensitized to it, even though, I've seen videos of this pushing and shoving by both sides, and it's awful. It's absolutely awful to watch. I'm not sure it rises to the level of partner violence. I don't know.
Yes, yeah.
Because it's going both ways. It's clearly going both ways. Do you feel that in the majority of your cases, justice is delivered, that there is the right result at the end of the case?
I do believe that in the majority of cases, justice is served, and that the forensic evaluator is able to provide the judge with useful, practical information about disorders, the likelihood of reoccurrence of them, and how the person's disorder may or may not influence parenting.
As somebody who has, and I'm speaking about myself, who has been in the courts for decades now, my experience is that the role of the forensic evaluator is critical, particularly in domestic violence matters. It is imperative that the court learn what is happening underneath the veneer of the relationship, and that the court is educated about these issues of domestic violence. So from my perspective, the forensic evaluators are absolutely critical. Dr. O'Leary, thank you so much for coming on this podcast and for sharing your expertise. Listeners, thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Was Justice Delivered? If you're looking to find Dr. O'Leary, he is on the stonybrook.edu website, where you can find his background and contact him if you would like. Doctor, again, thank you so much for coming on this episode.
Thank you for having me. It was fun, and very glad to be here.